These words were whispered for decades through the fog-laden valleys of eastern Kentucky, passed from one generation to the next like a warning carved into stone. But this was no legend. This was the true account of Opal May Slocum, a woman whose desperate choices would condemn 4 generations of her descendants to a fate worse than death itself. The year was 1923 when a young county nurse named Harriet Combs first heard the name Slocum Hollow. She was stationed in Harlan County, assigned to bring basic medical care to the remote communities that dotted the Appalachian Mountains like forgotten islands in a sea of coal dust and poverty. Harriet had seen hardship before. She had witnessed the devastating effects of black lung disease on miners, had held the hands of mothers who lost children to diseases that should have been preventable, but nothing in her training, nothing in her experience, had prepared her for what she would discover when she followed a winding creek bed into the shadow of Black Mountain. The morning mist hung heavy as she guided her mule along the narrow path. The trees grew thicker here, their branches intertwining overhead to create a natural tunnel that blocked out the autumn sun. Local folks in the town of Everts had warned her about this place. They spoke of the Slocums in hushed tones, crossing themselves and looking away when she asked for directions. "You don't want to go up there, ma'am," an old man at the general store had told her. "Ain't nothing in that hollow but sin and sorrow." But Harriet Combs was not a woman as easily deterred. A report had crossed her desk 3 weeks prior, filed by a traveling preacher who had stumbled upon the Slocum property while seeking shelter from a storm. His account was fragmented, almost incoherent, describing children who moved like shadows and adults whose faces bore the unmistakable marks of something deeply wrong. The Department of Health in Frankfort had dismissed the report as the ramblings of a man who had consumed too much moonshine. But Harriet had learned to trust her instincts, and something about the preacher's words had lodged itself in her mind like a splinter. After nearly 2 hours of climbing, she emerged into a small clearing. What she saw there would haunt her dreams for the rest of her days. A cluster of crude structures stood in the center of the hollow, built from rough-hewn logs and salvaged materials. Smoke rose from a central chimney, but there was no other sign of life. No chickens pecked at the ground. No dogs came running to investigate the stranger. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant cry of a crow. Harriet dismounted and approached the largest cabin slowly, her medical bag clutched against her chest like a shield. The door hung slightly open, revealing only darkness within. "Hello?" she called out. "My name is Harriet Combs. I'm a nurse from the county. I've come to check on your family's health." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then from the shadows of the doorway, a figure emerged. The woman who stood before Harriet appeared to be in her 50s, though her actual age was impossible to determine. Her hair hung in gray tangles around a face that seemed to collapse inward upon itself. The bones beneath the skin arranged in a configuration that defied normal anatomy. Her eyes were positioned too close together, giving her the appearance of perpetual concentration, and her jaw jutted forward at an angle that made speech difficult. But it was not her appearance that stopped Harriet's heart. It was the way the woman smiled, revealing a mouth that contained far too few teeth, and spoke words that would echo through the annals of Appalachian history. "You've come about the children," the woman said, "but you're too late. They were never truly alive to begin with." This was Opal May Slocum, and the story of how she brought rot to these mountains begins not in this hollow, but decades earlier, in a world that had already decided her fate before she drew her first breath. Opal May was born in 1868, just 3 years after the end of the Civil War, in a remote settlement called Possum Creek, located deep in the mountains of what was then still part of Virginia, before West Virginia's full separation. Her family, the Hensleys, had lived in these mountains for 4 generations, arriving sometime in the late 1700s from the Scottish Highlands. The Hensleys were what mountain folk called branchwater people, families who had settled so deep in the hollows that they had little contact with the outside world. Roads did not reach their homes. Schools did not exist for their children. Churches came and went with itinerant preachers who might visit once or twice a year. In such isolation, the Hensleys had developed their own customs, their own understanding of family and community. When Opal May's mother, Delilah, married at the age of 14, she married her first cousin, Thomas Hensley. This was not considered unusual. In fact, it was expected. The mountains were vast, travel was dangerous, and suitable partners were scarce. Thomas and Delilah Hensley would have 11 children together, though only 6 would survive past infancy. Of those 6, Opal May was the youngest, born when her mother was already in her 40s and worn down by decades of hard living. From the beginning, Opal May was different. While her siblings had inherited the subtle markers of their parents' close relation, Small oddities that could be explained away, Opal May displayed characteristics that could not be ignored. Her spine curved in a gentle S shape that grew more pronounced as she aged. Her fingers were unusually long, the joints bending in directions that seemed impossible. And most notably, she possessed what the mountain folk called the gift, an ability to sense when death was approaching a household. In reality, this was likely a manifestation of hyperacusis, an extreme sensitivity to sound that allowed her to hear the subtle changes in breathing patterns that preceded death. But in the superstitious world of the Appalachian frontier, such abilities marked a person as either blessed or cursed. Opal May's father chose to believe she was blessed. He kept her close, closer than was appropriate for a father and daughter. He whispered to her that she was special, that she had been chosen for a great purpose, that the family line must be preserved at all costs. What transpired within the Hensley cabin during Opal May's formative years was never spoken of directly. Mountain folk had a code of silence that protected the most intimate transgressions. But when Opal May gave birth to her first child at the age of 15, the father was not listed on any record. The child, a boy named Ezekiel, was born with severe malformations. His skull had not fully formed, leaving soft spots that pulsed visibly with each heartbeat. His eyes were clouded from birth. He lived for only 3 weeks. The second child came 2 years later, and the third 2 years after that. Each bore the increasingly visible marks of what modern medicine would come to understand as the accumulated genetic damage caused by generations of close family unions. By the time Opal May reached adulthood, she had developed a worldview shaped entirely by isolation and trauma. She believed, as her father had taught her, that the family bloodline was sacred and must remain pure. She saw the deformities of her children not as consequences of this practice, but as marks of divine selection, proof that her family had been set apart for a special purpose. In 1891, at the age of 23, Opal May left Possum Creek for the first and only time in her life. She traveled with her brother, Jeremiah, across the mountains into Kentucky, seeking land that was more fertile and more isolated than even the hollows of their birth. They found it in what would become known as Slocum Hollow, named not for any original Slocum, but for a corruption of the word Slocum, a phrase used by locals to describe how difficult it was to reach this place. Here, surrounded by mountains on all sides, accessible only by a single creek bed that became impassable for months during winter, Opal May and Jeremiah established their homestead. They built their first cabin together. They planted their first crops together, and together they began the process of creating a family that would shock the conscience of everyone who eventually discovered it. Over the next 30 years, Opal May bore 12 children. All of them were fathered by Jeremiah. And as these children grew, they too were taught the twisted gospel that Opal May had inherited from her own father. The family must remain pure. The bloodline must not be contaminated by outsiders. Marriage between siblings was not merely acceptable, it was mandatory. By the time Harriet Combs arrived in 1923, the Slocum family had existed in this hollow for over 3 decades. The original 12 children had produced children of their own, who had in turn produced more children. The genetic damage accumulated with each generation was catastrophic. Standing in that doorway, facing Opal May's unsettling smile, Harriet understood for the first time the true horror of what isolation and twisted belief could create. But she had not yet seen the children. She had not yet understood why Opal May had said they were never truly alive. That revelation would come soon enough. Before we continue deeper into this hollow and uncover the secrets that festered there for generations, take a moment to check if you're subscribed to this channel. What you're about to witness in the following chapters is a documented piece of American history that most textbooks refuse to acknowledge. If you want to understand the hidden darkness in humanity's past, hit that subscribe button now. Harriet Combs would later write in her official report that entering the Slocum compound was like stepping backward through time, past the modern era, past the Victorian age, into some primitive epoch where the rules of civilization had never taken root. Opal May led her through the main cabin, which served as a communal gathering space for the extended family. The interior was dark, lit only by the fire burning in a massive stone hearth and a few tallow candles that produced more smoke than light. The smell was overwhelming: unwashed bodies, rotting food, human waste, and something else, something organic and sickly sweet that Harriet could not immediately identify. "The young ones stay in the back buildings," Opal May explained, her malformed jaw making her words difficult to understand. "We keep them separate. They scare easy." Harriet followed her through a rear door and across a muddy courtyard to a structure that appeared to have been a barn at some point. The doors were secured with heavy chains and a padlock that looked incongruously new. "Why do you lock this building?" Harriet asked. Opal May's expression did not change. "To keep them safe, and to keep us safe." When the doors swung open, Harriet finally understood the true scope of what had been created in this hollow. The barn had been divided into small pens similar to those used for livestock. And in those pens, huddled in various states of undress, were the children. There were 9 of them visible, ranging in apparent age from perhaps 4 years old to late adolescence. But their actual ages were difficult to determine because their developmental progression had been so severely impaired. A girl who appeared to be 8 might have been 16. A boy who seemed to be an adolescent might have been in his 20s. The physical manifestations of generational genetic damage were present in every child. Microcephaly was common, with heads that seemed too small for their bodies. Limbs were often misshapen, legs bowed at impossible angles, arms that hung limp or twisted. Facial features showed the telltale clustering that occurs when genetic diversity is severely limited: eyes too close together, ears positioned low on the skull, jaws that receded or jutted forward dramatically. Several of the children had visible spinal deformities that left them unable to stand upright. Others bore the swollen joints of what would later be identified as severe arthritis, a condition almost unheard of in children but common when recessive genes for inflammatory conditions are expressed. But it was their behavior that disturbed Harriet most deeply. None of the children spoke. Few made sounds, grunts, and moans that seemed to express basic emotions, but formed language appeared to be beyond their capability. They moved in repetitive patterns, rocking back and forth, striking their heads against the wooden walls of their pens, picking at their own skin until it bled. When Harriet approached the nearest pen, girl with twisted limbs and a face frozen in a permanent expression of confusion, the child did not react to her presence at all. It was as if Harriet did not exist. "Can she see me?" Harriet asked. Opal May shrugged. Some can, some can't, makes no difference. They don't understand nothing anyway. How many children are there in total in this barn? 9 living. 3 more in the other building, but those ones are worse. Can't be around the others. They bite. And all of these children were born here. In this hollow? Opal May's smile returned, that unsettling expression of pride that seemed so misplaced given the horror surrounding them. Every last one. Pure blood. All of them. Not a drop of outsider in any of these babies. That's what makes them special. Harriet's medical training had not included extensive education on hereditary conditions. The science of genetics was still in its relative infancy in 1923. Gregor Mendel's work on inheritance had only been rediscovered 2 decades prior, and the practical applications were still being debated in academic circles. But Harriet did not need a degree in genetics to understand what she was seeing. 3 generations of close family unions had created a population in which harmful recessive traits had become dominant. Every child in this barn represented the accumulated damage of a family that had reproduced exclusively within itself for decades. She spent the next several hours documenting what she observed, making careful notes in her journal and attempting to assess the medical needs of each child. Most were severely malnourished. Many showed signs of untreated infections. Several had wounds that had healed badly, leaving scars and deformities on top of their inherited conditions. Throughout her examination, Opal May watched with an expression of maternal pride that made Harriet's skin crawl. This woman genuinely believed she had created something wonderful, something pure. She could not see the suffering in front of her, or perhaps she had convinced herself that suffering was simply part of divine selection. As the afternoon light began to fade, Harriet asked to see the adults of the community. She had only met Opal May, but she had seen evidence of others. Footprints in the mud, faces glimpsed briefly in windows, the sound of movement in nearby cabins. "They don't like strangers," Opal May said. "Makes them nervous. I need to assess their health as well. It's my job." After a long moment of consideration, Opal May nodded. "I'll gather them, but you have to promise you won't take none of them away. They belong here. This is their home." Harriet made no such promise, but she nodded nonetheless. Over the next hour, the adult members of the Slocum family emerged from their various dwellings and assembled in the main cabin. Harriet counted 17 adults, though the definition of adult was difficult to apply. Several appeared to be in their 30s or 40s, but displayed the cognitive capacity of young children. Others seemed to be adolescents, but had the weathered appearance of people twice their age. Family relationships were impossible to untangle visually because everyone shared similar features, the markers of their common ancestry visible in every face. Harriet would later spend weeks with county records and family Bibles attempting to construct a family tree, and what she eventually mapped was a web of interrelationships so complex and so transgressive that she would need to create new notation symbols to represent them. Opal May was the matriarch, the original source from which this family had grown. Her brother Jeremiah had passed away several years prior, but their children, now middle-aged adults themselves, had continued the practices they had been taught. Brothers had coupled with sisters, fathers had coupled with daughters. In at least 2 cases that Harriet could document, mothers had coupled with sons. The result was a population in which every individual was related to every other individual in multiple ways. A person might simultaneously be another's brother, cousin, and uncle. The genetic implications were catastrophic. Among the adults, Harriet noted similar health issues to those she had observed in the children, though often less severe. This was because those with the most serious conditions had simply not survived to adulthood. The cemetery she would discover the following day contained over 40 graves, most of them small, most of them unmarked. As darkness fell over Slocum Hollow, Harriet found herself unable to leave. The trail down the creek bed was treacherous enough in daylight. Attempting it at night would be foolish. Opal May offered her a space near the fire, and Harriet reluctantly accepted. That night, lying awake in the flickering shadows of the Slocum cabin, Harriet heard sounds that confirmed her worst suspicions about what continued to occur in this community. Sounds from nearby cabins. Sounds that no medical professional, no human being with a conscience could ignore. She did not sleep that night. Instead, she planned how she would return to Harlan County, how she would file her report, how she would convince the authorities to intervene in a situation that defied every law, every moral code, every basic standard of human decency. But she also knew, with a sinking certainty, that convincing anyone to take action would be far more difficult than it should be. The Slocums had lived in this hollow for over 30 years without interference. The outside world had forgotten them, or perhaps had chosen to forget them. Changing that would require more than just a report. It would require forcing people to confront a reality so disturbing that most would prefer to look away. What Harriet Combs did not know, lying there in the darkness of the Slocum cabin, was that she was not the first outsider to discover this hollow. She was not even the second. Others had come before her, and their stories, buried in county archives and forgotten documents, revealed that the conspiracy of silence surrounding the Slocum family extended far beyond the mountains. The truth was about to become far more complicated than she had imagined. The morning after her arrival, Harriet Combs departed Slocum Hollow with a promise to return. Opal May had watched her leave with an expression that mixed suspicion with something that might have been relief. Perhaps some part of her, buried beneath decades of twisted belief, understood that what she had created was wrong. The journey back to Harlan County took most of the day. By the time Harriet arrived at the county health office, exhaustion had carved deep lines into her face. But she did not rest. She immediately began composing her report, working through the night to document everything she had witnessed. The report ran to 23 handwritten pages. It described the physical conditions she had observed, the family structure she had been able to piece together, the living conditions, the obvious evidence of ongoing practices that violated both civil law and basic morality. She recommended immediate intervention, removal of the children to state care, medical treatment for all family members, and criminal investigation of the adults responsible for perpetuating these practices. When she submitted the report to her supervisor, a man named Dr. Harold Weston, she expected shock, she expected outrage, she expected immediate action. What she received instead was a long, uncomfortable silence. Dr. Weston read her report slowly, his expression unchanging. When he finished, he set the pages down on his desk and looked at Harriet with something that resembled pity. "Miss Combs," he said carefully, "I appreciate your dedication to your work, but I'm afraid this report cannot be filed." Harriet stared at him in disbelief. "Cannot be filed, Dr. Weston? Did you read what I wrote? There are children in that hollow who are being subjected to conditions that would shame a stable. There are adults engaging in acts that are illegal in every state of this nation. Something must be done." Dr. Weston leaned back in his chair. "Miss Combs, you are new to this region. You do not understand how things work in these mountains. I understand that children are suffering, and I understand, Doctor," Weston replied, his voice taking on a harder edge, "that those mountains are full of families just like the Slocums. Some worse, some not quite as bad, but all engaged in practices that would scandalize polite society. If we were to intervene in every such case, we would need an army of nurses and a fleet of vehicles and a budget 10 times what we currently possess." He stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the mountains that ringed the town. "There are also political considerations. Many of these families have lived in these hollows for generations. They vote when they can be convinced to do so. They have relatives in town. Interfering in their affairs would create complications that neither the county nor the state wishes to address, so we simply allow it to continue? Dr. Weston turned back to face her. We focus our limited resources on cases where we can make a difference. Cases where intervention will be welcomed, or at least tolerated. The Slocums have made their choices. They will live and die with the consequences. Harriet left that office with her report clutched in her hands. Rejected, dismissed, rendered meaningless by bureaucratic indifference. But she was not ready to give up. Over the following weeks, she contacted every agency she could think of: state health authorities, church organizations, newspapers in Lexington and Louisville. The responses she received were variations on the same theme. The Slocum situation was unfortunate, but it was not unique. Resources were limited. Priorities must be set. Perhaps in the future, when conditions allowed, something might be done. It was during this period of frustration that Harriet discovered she was not the first to attempt intervention with the Slocum family. A search through county archives revealed 2 previous incidents, both of which had been quietly buried. The first dated to 1905, when a timber company surveyor had stumbled upon the hollow while mapping the region for potential logging operations. His report, filed with the company and subsequently shared with county officials, described conditions similar to what Harriet had witnessed, though the family was smaller then, and the most severe genetic damage had not yet accumulated. The surveyor had recommended that the company avoid the area, not out of moral concern, but because he feared the Slocums might prove troublesome to logging operations. The county had filed his report and taken no action. The second incident was more disturbing. In 1912, a circuit court judge named William Carpenter had received a complaint from a distant relative of the Slocum family who had married out of the hollow decades earlier. This relative had heard rumors about what was occurring and felt compelled to report it. Judge Carpenter had actually traveled to the hollow to investigate. His personal notes, which Harriet found buried in a box of miscellaneous court documents, revealed that he had been horrified by what he discovered. He had intended to order the removal of all children and the prosecution of the adults. But something had changed his mind. The final entry in his notes, dated 2 weeks after his visit to the hollow, read simply, "Matter resolved. No further action required." Judge Carpenter had died in 1917, taking whatever knowledge he possessed to his grave. But Harriet could not help wondering what had caused him to abandon his investigation so abruptly. Had he been threatened? Bribed? Or had he simply decided, as Dr. Weston had, that the problem was too large and too complex to address? The truth, which Harriet would not discover until years later, was far more troubling. Judge Carpenter had been approached by representatives of a movement that was gaining influence throughout the country in the early 20th century, the eugenics movement. These representatives had argued that families like the Slocums served a valuable purpose. They were living examples of what happened when genetic fitness was ignored. They could be studied, documented, used as evidence for the importance of selective breeding and the danger of allowing unfit populations to reproduce. Judge Carpenter, initially resistant to this argument, had eventually been convinced. The Slocums would be left alone in exchange. Researchers would have access to the hollow for observation and documentation. It was a bargain struck in the shadows, never recorded in official documents, but its effects would shape the fate of the Slocum family for decades to come. Harriet knew none of this in 1923. What she knew was that every door she tried was closed to her, every avenue of intervention blocked by indifference or calculation, but she could not simply walk away. The faces of those children haunted her dreams. The sound of Opal May's voice explaining that her children were never truly alive echoed in her thoughts during every waking moment. So she made a decision that would define the rest of her career. She would document. She would bear witness. She would create a record so comprehensive and so undeniable that future generations would not be able to look away as her contemporaries had. Over the next several years, Harriet made regular visits to Slocum Hollow. She brought medical supplies, food, and clothing. She treated the conditions she could treat and documented those she could not. She earned, if not trust, then at least tolerance from Opal May and the other family members. During these visits, she compiled detailed genealogical records, tracking births, deaths, and the relationships between family members. She photographed the children, creating a visual archive of the progressive genetic damage that accumulated with each generation. She collected medical histories, noting which conditions appeared repeatedly and which seemed to emerge newly. Her records, eventually totaling hundreds of pages and dozens of photographs, would become one of the most comprehensive documentations of a consanguineous community in American history. They would be cited in medical journals, referenced in policy debates, and studied by geneticists seeking to understand the mechanisms of inherited disease. But for Harriet, the work was never about academic recognition. It was about bearing witness. It was about ensuring that the suffering she observed would not be forgotten or denied. If this story has moved you, if you feel the weight of what these forgotten children endured, take a moment right now to leave a comment below. Simply write, "These children deserved better." Let your voice join with others who refuse to let this history remain hidden. The years passed. Opal May aged, her already twisted body becoming more bent and frail. The children Harriet had first observed grew into damaged adults, some surviving, many not. New children were born, each carrying the accumulated weight of their ancestry in their bodies. And then, in 1931, everything changed. The winter of 1931 was brutal in eastern Kentucky. Snow fell in early November and did not melt until late March. Temperatures plunged below zero and stayed there for weeks at a time. The coal mines closed, leaving thousands without income. Hunger stalked the hollows like a predator. Harriet Combs had not been able to visit Slocum Hollow since October. The creek bed that served as the only access route was impassable, buried under feet of ice and snow. She worried constantly about the family, knowing that their food stores were always meager and their ability to forage or hunt was limited by their physical conditions. When the thaw finally came in late March, she organized an expedition to check on the Slocums. She brought with her 2 volunteers from a church charity organization, along with a mule laden with supplies. The journey into the hollow took longer than usual because the spring melt had turned the creek bed into a rushing torrent. Several times they had to wait for the water to subside before they could continue. By the time they reached the Slocum compound, the sun was already setting. What they found there was a scene of devastation. The main cabin had partially collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow. The barn where the children had been kept was standing but barely, its walls bowed outward and its roof sagging dangerously. Smoke rose from a makeshift shelter that had been constructed against the remaining wall of the main cabin. Harriet rushed forward, calling out for Opal May for anyone who might respond. The first person she found was a young man she recognized as one of Opal May's grandchildren. A man in his 20s, but with the cognitive development of a young child. He was sitting in the snow near the collapsed portion of the cabin, rocking back and forth and making a keening sound that Harriet had come to recognize as an expression of distress. "What happened?" she asked, though she knew he could not answer. She continued her search, entering the makeshift shelter through a gap in the canvas covering. Inside, huddled around a small fire, she found the survivors. There were 11 of them. 11 out of the more than 30 people who had been living in the hollow when Harriet last visited. Opal May was among them, though barely recognizable. She had always been thin, but now she was skeletal, her skin hanging loose on her misshapen frame. Her eyes, always intense, had taken on a hollow quality that suggested she was no longer entirely present in this world. "What happened here?" Harriet demanded, kneeling beside the old woman. Opal May's lips moved, but no sound emerged at first. Then, slowly, in a voice that crackled like dry leaves, she spoke. "The winter took them, one by one. The little ones first, like always. Then the weak ones. Then the strong ones who went looking for food and never came back." She paused, her eyes focusing on something Harriet could not see. "I tried to keep them alive. I tried to keep the blood pure, but the cold didn't care about blood. The cold took them all the same." Harriet spent the next several hours assessing the survivors and distributing the supplies she had brought. The physical condition of those who remained was desperate. Frostbite had claimed fingers and toes. Malnutrition had weakened already fragile bodies. Infections festered in wounds that had gone untreated for months. But the physical damage was only part of the story. The psychological trauma of what these people had endured was written on their faces, in their movements, in the way they flinched at sudden sounds and stared blankly at anyone who tried to speak to them. Among the survivors were 3 children young enough that they might still be helped. Harriet made a decision that she knew would have consequences. When she left the hollow the next day, she took those 3 children with her. Opal May did not protest. Perhaps she understood that she no longer had the strength to care for them. Perhaps she had finally accepted that her vision of a pure bloodline had led only to suffering and death. Or perhaps she simply no longer cared about anything at all. The 3 children were placed in the care of the county, eventually being adopted by families in other parts of Kentucky. Their genetic inheritance would follow them throughout their lives, manifesting in health problems and developmental challenges. But they would survive. They would have opportunities that would have been impossible had they remained in the hollow. For the 8 adults who remained in Slocum Hollow, including Opal May, No such rescue was possible. They refused to leave, clinging to the only home they had ever known. Harriet arranged for regular supply deliveries and medical visits, but she knew it was only a matter of time before the Hollow claimed them all. Opal May Slocum died in the autumn of 1933, almost exactly 10 years after Harriet had first met her. She was approximately 65 years old, though no birth certificate existed to confirm her exact age. She was buried in the family cemetery next to the brother who had been her partner and the dozens of children and grandchildren who had preceded her in death. Her death did not mark the end of the Slocum family. A few descendants survived in the Hollow for another decade, gradually dying off as age and accumulated health problems took their toll. The last known resident of Slocum Hollow, a man named Ezra Slocum, who was simultaneously Opal May's son and grandson, died in 1944. But the story of what had occurred in that hollow would not remain buried. Harriet Combs' documentation, carefully preserved, would eventually find its way to researchers who understood its significance. In the 1950s, as the science of genetics advanced rapidly, medical researchers began to study families like the Slocums to understand how inherited diseases were transmitted across generations. The Slocum records, with their detailed genealogies and medical histories, became an important resource. What these researchers found was a textbook example of what happens when genetic diversity is eliminated from a population. The Slocum family had demonstrated in the most tragic way possible how recessive genes for harmful conditions can accumulate and express themselves when close relatives produce offspring together. Among the conditions documented in the Slocum family were severe intellectual disabilities, skeletal malformations including spinal curvature and limb abnormalities, cardiac defects that caused early death, vision and hearing impairments, immune system dysfunction that made common infections deadly, and neurological conditions that caused seizures and behavioral disturbances. Many of these conditions had appeared in the founder generation, the children of Opal May and Jeremiah, and had become more severe and more common in each subsequent generation. By the fourth generation, virtually every child born in the Hollow displayed multiple serious health problems. The researchers who studied the Slocum family also noted something else: the complicity of the outside world in allowing this tragedy to unfold. Their papers documented the multiple opportunities for intervention that had been ignored, the bureaucratic indifference that had condemned children to suffering, the moral calculations that had prioritized convenience over humanity. These findings contributed to a broader reckoning in American society about how isolated communities were treated and how genetic conditions were understood. They helped shape policies regarding child welfare, public health intervention, and genetic counseling that would prevent similar tragedies in the future. But for the Slocum family themselves, this reckoning came too late. 4 generations had lived and died in that hollow, their lives shaped by beliefs and practices that had been allowed to continue unchecked for decades. The hollow itself eventually returned to forest, the cabins collapsing and being reclaimed by the vegetation of the mountains. Today, nothing visible remains of the Slocum compound. Only the cemetery still exists, its weathered headstones marking the graves of people whose lives were defined by isolation, twisted belief, and genetic tragedy. And somewhere in those archives, preserved for history, are Harriet Combs' photographs of the children of Slocum Hollow. Children with ancient eyes and young faces. Children whose bodies bore the visible marks of their ancestry. Children who were born into a world that had already decided their fate. Children who, as Opal May had said, were never truly alive. The final chapter of the Slocum Hollow tragedy did not end with the death of the last family member. It continued to unfold in laboratories, courtrooms, and policy offices for decades afterward, as the lessons of what had occurred in that forgotten Kentucky Hollow shaped how America understood genetics, isolation, and the obligations of society to its most vulnerable members. In 1957, a geneticist named Dr. Raymond Collier published a landmark paper titled Genetic Deterioration in an Isolated Appalachian Population, the Slocum Family Study, using Harriet Combs' documentation, along with medical records and physical examinations of the 3 surviving children who had been removed from the hollow. Dr. Collier constructed a comprehensive analysis of how harmful genetic traits had accumulated across 4 generations. His findings were sobering. The founder generation, the children of Opal May and Jeremiah, had shown mild manifestations of several genetic conditions. These included minor skeletal irregularities, slightly reduced cognitive function, and increased susceptibility to certain diseases. While noticeable, these conditions had not prevented the individuals from surviving and reproducing. The second generation, the children of sibling unions within the founder generation, displayed these conditions more severely. Skeletal malformations became pronounced. Cognitive impairment became significant. Infant mortality increased dramatically. By the third generation, the genetic damage had become catastrophic. The majority of children born were so severely affected that they could not survive without constant care. Those who survived were profoundly disabled, unable to speak, unable to care for themselves, often unable to even recognize other human beings as distinct from inanimate objects. The fourth generation, the youngest children Harriet had observed, represented the endpoint of this process. Of the 11 children born to fourth-generation mothers in the Hollow, only 3 survived past infancy. All 3 displayed severe malformations and profound intellectual disability. These were the children Harriet had removed. And even with the best medical care available at the time, their lives were marked by constant health challenges. Dr. Collier's paper introduced a concept that would become central to genetic counseling: the coefficient of inbreeding. This mathematical measurement described how closely related the parents of an individual were, based on their common ancestry. In a typical population, this coefficient might be 0 or very close to it. Among first cousins who married, it would be approximately 6%. In the final generation of the Slocum family, Dr. Collier calculated that the coefficient of inbreeding exceeded 40%. This meant that the children born in the Hollow were, genetically speaking, more closely related to themselves than siblings in a normal family would be to each other. The implications for genetic diversity and for the expression of harmful recessive traits were devastating. Dr. Collier's work contributed to the development of genetic counseling services, which became widely available in the following decades. These services provided information to couples about the potential genetic risks of having children, particularly if they shared common ancestry. While controversial at first, genetic counseling eventually became accepted as a standard part of reproductive health care. The Slocum case also influenced legal reforms regarding intervention in cases of child endangerment. The documentation of multiple failed attempts to help the Slocum children highlighted gaps in the child welfare system that allowed abuse and neglect to continue, unchecked when they occurred in isolated communities or involved practices that local authorities were reluctant to address. In 1962, Kentucky passed legislation requiring mandatory reporting of suspected child abuse or neglect by medical professionals, teachers, and other individuals who worked with children. While this legislation was not directly inspired by the Slocum case, the case was cited in legislative debates as an example of what could happen when warning signs were ignored. The broader cultural impact of the Slocum story was more difficult to measure. As news of the case spread through academic publications and eventually popular media, it contributed to a growing awareness of the hidden communities that existed in the margins of American society. The Hollow Hills of Appalachia, once romanticized as bastions of authentic American culture, came to be understood as places where poverty, isolation, and lack of education could create conditions that were harmful to those who lived there. This understanding was not without its complications. Some used the Slocum case and similar examples to stigmatize Appalachian communities, portraying them as backward and genetically degraded. This stigma persisted for decades and contributed to discrimination against people from the region. Others argued that the Slocum case demonstrated the failure of American society to extend basic services and protections to all its citizens. If roads had reached the Hollow, if schools had been available, if medical care had been accessible, the tragedy might have been prevented. The fault lay not with the isolated families themselves, but with a nation that had allowed them to be forgotten. Harriet Combs lived to see both interpretations take hold in the public consciousness. She spent her later years giving lectures on public health and community intervention, using the Slocum case as a cautionary tale. She died in 1968, 50 years after Opal May was born, and exactly 100 years after the stock of circumstances that would eventually create the Slocum tragedy began to take shape. In her final interviews, Harriet reflected on what she had learned from her decades of work with the Slocum family. "People ask me who was to blame," she said in a recorded interview from 1965. Was it Opal May for perpetuating practices she had been taught were sacred? Was it her father who had taught her those practices in the first place? Was it the county officials who refused to intervene? Was it the medical community that chose not to see what was happening? Was it the nation that allowed such isolation to exist in the first place? She paused, her aged face thoughtful in the filmed recording. The answer is that blame matters less than understanding. What happened in that hollow was not the result of one person's choices. It was the result of many choices made over many generations, by many people who either could not see or chose not to see where those choices would lead. The children of Slocum Hollow did not choose to be born into that family. They did not choose to inherit the genetic burdens that twisted their bodies and limited their minds. They were innocent, every one of them, and they deserved better than the world they were born into. That is the lesson of Slocum Hollow. Not that isolated communities are dangerous or that close family ties are inherently wrong. The lesson is that we have obligations to one another that transcend the boundaries we create between ourselves. When we allow those obligations to be forgotten, when we turn away from suffering because it is distant or uncomfortable or inconvenient, we become complicit in whatever follows. Opal May Slocum believed she was preserving something precious by keeping her family pure. In the end, she destroyed everything she claimed to value. Her children were never truly alive because she had denied them the chance to be fully human, to be part of a larger world, to have the genetic heritage that would allow them to thrive. We should not judge her too harshly. She was a product of her circumstances, as we all are, but we should learn from her. We should remember that isolation is not purity, that tradition is not always wisdom, and that the families we create are not possessions to be controlled, but individuals who deserve the chance to choose their own paths. The hollow that once held the Slocum compound is silent now. The trees have grown tall where cabins once stood. The creek runs clear over rocks that once bore the footprints of children who never knew another world. But the story remains preserved in archives and academic papers, in the memories of those who encountered it and in the policies it helped to shape. It is a story of darkness, certainly, a story of twisted belief in genetic tragedy and societal failure, but it is also a story of bearing witness, of refusing to look away, of insisting that the forgotten deserve to be remembered. The woman who brought rot to Appalachia is gone. Her children, who were never truly alive in the way that full human lives should be lived, have passed beyond the suffering that defined their existence. But the questions her story raises remain as urgent as ever. How do we balance respect for privacy with the obligation to protect the vulnerable? How do we provide support to isolated communities without imposing values from outside? How do we ensure that the children born today have the genetic heritage and the social conditions that will allow them to thrive? These are questions without easy answers, but they are questions we must continue to ask, if the lessons written in the bones of the Slocum children are not to be forgotten. If you have watched until this moment, you have witnessed a piece of history that most would prefer to forget, but you did not look away. You allowed these forgotten lives to matter, to be witnessed, to be remembered. If you have watched until here, it is because this story moved you. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can know who really appreciates the stories on this channel. This is not entertainment. This is testimony. And you are now part of the community that refuses to let the voiceless remain unheard. If this account has affected you, take a moment now to subscribe to this channel so that you will be present when other hidden histories are brought into the light. Hit the like button to help others find these stories. And share this video with someone who values truth, even when that truth is difficult to bear. The children of Slocum Hollow deserve to have their story told. Thank you for being here to hear it.